Welcome to the Simpleton Podcast. I'm here today with some Catholic workers who just launched the new JPII Catholic Worker Farm. They also have the Morin Academy. Spencer, Emily, and there's a third Catholic worker that's not here today, Dr. Laurie Johnson.
Laurie
Johnson. Thank you for correcting me. Well, welcome, Spencer and Emily.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Are you guys sitting at the farm right now?
Yeah.
Yep.
In the living room in one of the houses.
Yep.
All right.
Got a few. So.
Mm-hmm.
So when did this farm start? It's a fairly recent foundation, right?
Yeah. So I would say it kind of organically grew out of another cooperative farming project that I'd started. I moved here in 2019 with two other friends, and the dream was to kind of do some market gardening, so like small urban farming, and then process that food into stuff like kimchi and sauerkraut, and then kind of make a living doing that, kind of living communally, working communally, and then basically demonstrating that there's another way to live and grow our food.
And I'm interested in your guys' story because I feel like you guys came to the Catholic Church fairly recently and you kind of came out of this environmental farming movement. Can you say like what initially brought you to that movement and then like anything about how that journey ended up bringing you to this kind of Orthodox Catholic faith?
I can start, I guess. I have a degree in environmental science, so I guess I've been thinking about environmental things for several years now. And in college, I got involved with like a very leftist group organizing for like climate change, justice, reform, and everything like that. And we were hosting different strikes, anything you could think of that like these like climate justice organizations do. We probably did it. And that was also happening like as COVID was, I don't know, eventually becoming more prevalent in our world, I guess. But I grew very disillusioned over time with just like the way we were doing things and how we were spending a lot of time just like planning out strikes or planning out protests, but not actually trying to like reorient how we're changing like our own lives and other people's lives around us. So over time, I kind of like fell out of those circles. And that's whenever I encountered Spencer, and he was already farming in Kansas City. And I kind of latched on to what he was doing.
When you were a climate activist, did you do anything illegal?
Yeah.
Are you allowed to say what it is, or maybe the statute of limitations?
It wasn't even anything that exciting. We like put up different posters and stuff on buildings we shouldn't have, but things that could come down. But yeah.
More like petty vandalism.
Petty vandalism, not actual
blowing up pipelines.
Yeah.
Did you do anything else crazy? Like when you say strikes, you don't mean like attacks. You mean like you got like workers to strike?
Still taking like the movement grew a lot from like a similar, I guess we can overlap with Catholic worker, but like this nonviolent strike movement basically was still that. But it still took a lot of time. And what the movement at the time was organizing for wasn't still like, how do we change people's lives? It was like, how do we like push politicians to vote for Democrats or for like liberal policies, rather than like, how are we like really taking after the people around us, I guess, and taking responsibility for that.
Do you think they were effective at the goals that they had?
I don't think so. I think to some degree, like they have raised more awareness, I guess, which like for better or worse, I guess you could say that that's still doing some good. But I think the mission of doing those things can sometimes get lost. And then when you're in these very left circles, you have like identity politics coming in a lot, and you're like bombarded with all these other things, and trying to still actually make some kind of movement happen is really hard when you're trying to please everyone in the circle. So if that makes sense.
At some point you met Spencer, right? Should we talk about Spencer's background real quick before you guys meet? So Spencer, how did you come to this?
I would say the long and the short of it is like I had a kind of troubled youth from basically like teenage years to age 21. And we don't want to get too bogged down in that. But basically by age 21, I had like a nervous breakdown because I could no longer take a term I've heard is like affluenza, that like I felt like trapped in like a middle class hyper-capitalist dystopia where like it wasn't clear to me what anything meant or how I should meaningfully live my life or what was even true. That's kind of dramatic, but around that time, for reasons that are hard to articulate because you really have to be in that headspace, I got baptized in Pentecostal church and I started caring about my food. And both of these were kind of about like touching a bedrock of like reality for me. It's like there is a world outside of just like suburbia, and there are real values, both supernatural and natural, that should be guiding my life. But then from there, because when you're baptized in Pentecostal church, there's not a ton of structure unless you just fully buy into everything they're teaching you. So for me, it started this whole journey about like, okay, I'm nominal, some kind of Christian, I've been baptized, but what that means is very broad. So I kind of went out in the world. I became an apprentice on an organic farm. I read a bunch of stuff about politics and theology, and eventually I went back to college, and that's where I met Dr. Laurie Johnson. And it was this whole basically 10-year journey from age 21 to 31 where I got confirmed into the Catholic Church last August. And part of that, throughout that whole 10-year period, part of that grounding was either farming or studying about farming and how it interacts with the theology and with the politics.
Were you raised on a farm, or are you from kind of like a suburb, or where are you from?
I would say I was raised like farm adjacent in the sense that all of my grandparents farmed. My parents left the farms, and well, one of my grandpas he was like a lawyer, gentleman farmer, but my parents were raised on or around farms, and then they became professionals. And then they met in Dodge City, which is in Western Kansas, where you're surrounded by farmland and the packing plants, where we process the meat. And so I was never directly farming, but it was part of the culture of being out there, quote unquote, as opposed to in the cities. So again, this kind of hybrid thing. I was like rural, but living in kind of like a small suburb, but without an urban center around it, if that makes sense.
So you kind of had this like trying to get back to reality. You kind of became Christian, and you became kind of very concerned about food and farming, mm-hmm. right? And then after that, did the Christianity like stay strong during this whole like return to college type period, or?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And it was from age 21, it was clear to me that how we treat the soil is interrelated with how we treat people, and is interrelated with how we view God. That like, in this sense, I had a Catholic impulse, meaning like according to the whole. I saw that this was all like one thing. And part of what I had to work out, like being raised in Republican country, and like I became conscious. I kind of believe I started paying attention to the world like at 9/11. So it was waking up in like Republican country post 9/11. You know, there's all these contradictions about like, okay, so we believe in God, we need to love our neighbors, but poor people in cities are wasting our money, and we don't have money for that. But we do have money to wage all these wars. But the government shouldn't raise my taxes, but I don't complain when we're shooting missiles, but I do complain when we're supporting welfare. There were all these things that, as like an intellectually sensitive kid, I was getting all this like intellectual whiplash because people were making like prudential judgments that to me didn't like rationally follow, if that makes sense. And so part of my 10 years was kind of like, it's an overused word, but deconstructing, like making sense of all of this.
What was your first kind of like touch with the farming movement? Like when you went back to college, but like were you also working on a farm at that time, or what?
So I worked on my first farm, then I went back to college, and then I worked on farms after that. During college, I got an internship at the nonprofit that I worked on until recently here in Kansas City. I had another internship with the student farm / I was like the alternatingly the president and vice president of the farm club. So part of what I tried to do at K-State was kind of organize like the organic farming scene within K-State, which was almost non-existent when I arrived and was barely existent after I left.
And K-State's a big agricultural university. Just so people don't know that, right?
Right, but a big agricultural, like industrial ag university. Yeah, there's very little resources devoted to organic farming, although I hear that's somewhat improved.
Now, when you are meeting people who are like-minded with you about food and agriculture, are you meeting like what a lot of people would think of as like a bunch of hippies or something like this? Or are you meeting other Christians? Like, what is that scene like?
The vast majority of them are like secular / new agey hippies. There are a few Christians who do get it, especially ones that are coming from farms. But mostly secular hippies who have these values that we should take care of the earth. But one of the things I did under the farm club that I was the president of, we started Farm Club Book Club because I naively thought, I'm running into all these hippies. They clearly don't know anything outside of like, we should take care of the environment. And I naively thought, well, let's read some Michael Pollan books and they'll want to learn and they'll read books. And then we'll like get more passionate and devoted to realizing these values. And what I learned is no, they don't show up. So then it turned into this book club of like me and my friends. And
when you say Michael Pollan, what's the thrust of those books? What's the idea behind that?
So I would say his whole oeuvre is basically talking about the interrelationship between human culture and nature and how we navigate those things. So his first book was about his adventures in gardening and exploring the literature around gardening. His second book was about architecture and how we basically take natural elements and build things. He's written a bunch of things. For me, if listeners wanted to only read one Pollen book, I would recommend The Omnivore's Dilemma, where he has 4 different meals that are basically from 4 different supply chains. And leading up to all these meals, he is chasing the majority of the ingredients from the soil to the plate. So he tracks, a grain of corn from a farm in Iowa or somewhere to a packing plant, or to being fed in a feedlot to a cow, to being in a packing plant in Garden City, which is a town kind of near Dodge City, where I grew up. And then he does, so basically he does industrial conventional agriculture, what that food chain's like, industrial organic agriculture, local organic agriculture, and hunting gathering.
So are you kind of saying that there's like this naive part of the organic food movement and you're trying to give them more an intellectual framework or start discussions to make it more intellectual? Because like you're not introducing them to like Christian spirituality in the book club. You're trying to introduce them into.
Yeah. At that time, like, I mean, I had these Christian beliefs. I was going to church on Sundays, but I was not directly, if people wanted to talk about it, I was open to it. But I think to some extent you have to accept the parameters of your social environment. And it was already hard enough to get them to write a book or read a book about things that they allegedly cared about. So I wasn't going there with that group of people at that time, no.
So you found the intellectual life of the movement wanting, and that's what you're trying to address in the book club?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And not because, I think there's a danger of over intellectualizing things or over rationalizing whatever. There is, but there's also, it's not good to be ignorant, I don't think. And so that was the hope. And then what it turned into is a book club with my friends that arguably over the years, as it turned into other book clubs, turned into the Morin Academy.
Tell us about the Morin Academy, but it also seems like what you're saying is that there's a naivety in the movement that I think other people have sensed too. And you're trying to like say, no, this needs to be a more serious project than that.
Right. Okay. Right. Because like, is this about, I would say like life or death issues? Is this about how nutritious our food is? Is it about, therefore the medical issues that can flow from having a bad diet? Is it about how we take care of the environment? Is it about at least reducing the harm caused by climate change? Because if it is, it's a life or death thing. Laurie would argue it's a national security issue. Mm-hmm.
Or is it just like an identity you can take on in your early 20s that you might discard sometime later?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Functionally, I think for a lot of people, it is like an identity politics, which also requires another identity group that you're opposed to, meaning more or less Republicans, who, if they would just believe the same things that we do, then everything would be okay. Because the reason we don't have a good local food isn't because I have a shallow left liberal identity politics about food. It's that there are hate-filled right liberals out there that don't know that I'm right.
So at probably closer to the end of this podcast, I want to discuss your podcast because I think you guys delve into some interesting things. But one of the things that comes up again and again in your podcast is this idea that like, we all know McDonald's is not good for us. Like no one actually pretends it is, and yet they do a bustling business. You know, it's like the idea is fully there, you know?
Yeah. And so my entire life, nobody has ever taught me, you know, in rural Western Kansas, public education, nobody has ever told me McDonald's is healthy and our sneakers aren't made in sweatshops.
Right. Yeah. Yet they're doing fine. You know what I mean? So it's like the ideas are not the problem. There's some other problem.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, everyone's accepting the facts, but there's a problem, you know? Well, tell me about how you went from this moment in your life where you're realizing that there needs to be more intellectualism and stuff like this, all the way to the point that you either meet Emily or get interested in the Catholic social doctrine or Catholic faith.
So I went back to college, I graduated, and I woofed for a year. Woof is World Workers on Organic Farms. Basically, it's a work share where...
Can I pause you?
Yeah.
The co-host of this podcast is Laura Heeman, and she woofed, just so that our audience knows that. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great thing to do if you either want to learn how to farm or just travel for relatively cheaply.
Mm-hmm.
Good thing. So yeah, I woofed for a year, mostly in the South. And part of what I was doing was trying to sort of summarize all of the ideas that I've learned and try and like apply the theory that, okay, I know we need to organically farm. Kind of what I was talking about, from how do we integrate our lives from soil to God? And then how do I do that with other people? Because I realize like a core insight I have is like, as an individual, I am pretty impotent. We're social beings, and to accomplish anything at any kind of scale, you have to do it with other people. So what came out of this was this kind of vision I had of a kind of, for lack of a better term, like an anarchist collective, where me and my friends, hopefully from back at K-State, because we all at least went to the Farm Club Book Club and we read the Michael Pollen and we read the Wendell Berry. And so obviously we should see the profound import of living out these ideas. And I'm open to better ideas, but I don't really see people around applying better ideas. So why not try this?
Well, by the way, was that idea that you're having in how did that fit within the broader kind of organic farm movement? Like, were you seeing a problem in the movement and this is your new alternative, or was that just a widely accepted? Do you know what I mean?
Right. I would say, I think this is a controversial position. My take is that the main limiting factor from keeping organic farming to being bigger and more successful than it actually is that these are not actually all that profitable businesses. It's very hard to make a profit. I knew that when I came to Kansas City. I know it even more now. It is very, very hard to make a profit. And so what that means is that in people's heads, and we're talking about the people that are like dedicated enough to like, okay, we're going to run farms, we're going to work on farms. So we're not talking about the people that just think it's cool, or that they're woke or whatever because they care about this. We're talking about the people, the minority that are doing something. What tends to happen is they're not all that profitable, and because they can't imagine working with other people to basically scale up and make this thing work and think creatively about, okay, this isn't working right, what else can we do? What they then tend to do is just buckle down on being, I'm a small business owner and I'm competing with all these other small business owners. And we're competing for a bigger slice of a very small pie instead of asking, how do we work with other people to make this pie bigger? But they tell themselves somehow or other, if I can get a bigger slice of this pie, the whole pie is going to get bigger.
So instead of making new consumers, they're just fighting for the consumers that are there type idea.
That is primarily what is true. Now, that's not to say that here or there the market isn't growing, and they say it is, especially like as it's gone industrial and Walmart has started selling stuff. But
like even Amazon's in the organic food business now, like
sure.
They own Whole Foods and stuff, right?
Sure.
And I find this interesting, even though it's not really about your spiritual conversion. You know, like most people would think, like when a small industry can't figure out how to grow the pie, you form like a trade organization or something.
Mm-hmm.
But what was your take on this? Like,
so go back real quick. You said most people think you should do that.
Well, I think like if you have a small like hobby or thing that's like what do you call it when something's like dispersed? Like there's like it's not unified, and if it was unified, it could actually work to grow the pie.
Right.
Right. So then you work for some organization that can like somehow take the common interests of the individuals and like grow the pie.
Sure.
Like a trade organization or something.
Right. Yeah. Peter Moore like to talk about guilds. We're part of the Kansas City Food Hub, which is trying to do, as far as I know, it's the best example of somebody in this area trying to do that. So the idea is it's a cooperative owned by the farmers, and basically it's taking on the marketing and distribution costs to basically then be able to say, okay, you're a hospital, you're a school district, you wouldn't buy from one farm, but would you buy from 20 or 30 farms?
Well, can I ask you a question about farming that I don't want to get totally off your spiritual journey, but like my grandfather was a farmer and my mom lived on a farm with like all her brothers and sisters, big family, and they were basically subsistence. Like I think they bought sugar and coffee, you know, but everything else they basically ate what they grew, and he was in everything. He was in like beef, pork, couple acre garden, et cetera, right? And none of those kids wanted to continue that, right? And he was successful. Like he, by the time he passed, had paid off the farm, and it was worth quite a bit, you know, having all that land paid off, right? And what I kind of started seeing at the end of his life was I saw like, and this is also in Kansas, is I saw like abandoned houses even on his property. So that like what used to be 300-acre farms or 100-acre farms had grown into like 1,500-acre farms. And therefore, literally the number of families being supported on the land had gone down. Mm-hmm. Right. And I also started thinking that I started seeing farmers drive things like Mercedeses, you know, and it didn't strike me they were that profitable, but it struck me that like, they were buying, their combine was worth $80K plus. Like every tractor they drove was so massive, you know, expensive, you know, that I'm sure when it came to their car, they're like, oh, $50K car, no problem. It's right. Like early 90s, you know. And I started to wonder, you know, it seemed like if your choice was to be a great farmer and an okay accountant and financier, or a great accountant and financier and an okay farmer, you'd do way better if you were good at accounting and finance than farming. Mm-hmm. You know, it just seemed like the nature of the business they were in was more about finance and accounting than actually being a good farmer.
Right.
Right.
Right. So the classic text on this is Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America. And he devotes a lot of time to critiquing Earl Butz, who was the like ag secretary under Nixon. Mm-hmm. And there's pages where Berry just talks about how as soon as Earl Butz's deal is plant fence row to fence row, hedgerow to hedgerow, you're not farmers, you're agribusinessmen. You're not husbandmen. You're not married to the land. You're not married to your livestock. You're not, this is the quiet part, you're not married to your family and your community. You are married to growing your business, to managing lines of credit so you can constantly expand.
And it seems like that, like a lot of what I think of as big ag is not actually like industrial. Is it's just like the most successful family in that small town ended up owning, you know, 10,000 acres, you know, plus, right? Like super family farm or something like that. And I think also saying people don't realize is I started meeting farmers who were like really good farmers who had zero land. Like they would like own a combine and that was their business, and they'd work other people's land all year. You know, mm-hmm. I just thought that was an interesting, and I feel like this organic movement it feels like it's for the love of farming, like real farming. Mm-hmm. But then just as an outsider, it looks like it's almost like naive about the actual agribusiness part.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Right. I would say part of it, another perspective on what you're talking about, is that organic farming is shot through with various kinds of romanticism. And all of that, even if people were disposed to look at what is the hard economic reality we're farming in, what is that context, they don't want to do it because they want to believe it's about reconnecting with nature. They want to believe it's being a rugged individual who's kind of making their way against the elements. They want to believe it's about small is beautiful. So then asking the question, what are we really accomplishing? Are we really building a local food system? If we have like an economic downturn, how many of these small farms survive?
I love it. I feel like that is a big thrust in your podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love that realism, because I also feel like there's so much, like even some of the guests you've had where it's like the organic farmer just starts whining about capitalism as opposed to like engaging it.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the bridge too far, but but it's like they'd rather be romantic and complain than like be like, okay, what's the real situation?
What is the real situation? Yeah. Although I would say that farmer was trying to say, I mean, I read him as basically defending capitalism. Like he was whining about people whining about capitalism.
Right.
And part of his deal where he's not a normal organic farmer, he's saying, look, capitalism is real. There's nothing we can do about it. There's no way. Like he would say, my kind of anarchistic cooperative vision, you can't really do it. And so we just need to accept those parameters and we need to figure out some way to work within them. And where a lot of Catholics, I think, still suspect me is because I still have a certain amount of leftist baggage where I'm like, yeah, or maybe we do need to change society. Maybe this economic system where we've liquidated the rural centers so everybody can be in urban centers. And then there's just, a few farmers per county driving Benzes in their like $1 million combines. Maybe this is an insane social order and maybe it's very unnatural. And ultimately I would say demonic.
I have so many like ideas and questions about that. I don't know if that's the right road for us to go down. Cause like part of the question is also like, why did my mom and all of her siblings leave?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And they could have stayed, but they chose not to. And they were on a successful farm, that did have it wasn't an organic farm, but it was like diverse, in its, endeavors and things. But then you try your anarchistic community farming. And these are great podcasts you have too when you detail what happened there. But how about you tell us, like, how'd that go?
I mean, I met Emily through it.
So it's a success. That's great.
Pretty much the majority of the rest of it. I mean, and I try and take some comfort in playing the long game. Like, did Farm Club Book Club accomplish its goals? Probably not. But now we have the Morn Academy. Was I successful at all in working with friends to collectively farm? And then was that farming in any way profitable? Definitely not. A number of relationships have been damaged, if not irreparably broken, because of just the vicissitudes of doing this type of thing. And we didn't even make money.
Right. Now, I feel like at this point in life, most of the really dedicated organic farmers kind of go a different direction.
Yeah.
But you stayed on. And then can you tell me about how you guys like discovered, like what led to the attraction of the Catholic Church and this new like direction you're on as a Catholic worker farm?
Just to briefly go back, I'm sorry, this is like a chronological nightmare. Dr. Laurie Johnson, who's like now my best friend, was a professor. She was a Catholic. So she kind of nudged me towards Catholicism. And so really from college on, as I traveled around the country, on any given Sunday, 90% of those, I went to a Catholic church because just liturgically, it just felt way more right to be there than anywhere else. So I was already like leaning towards that.
Doesn't the Catholic Church seem like the opposite of an anarchistic, like when you say you're attracted to the liturgy and like maybe order of the Mass?
Right.
It's that kind of, go ahead.
Here's growing up in Protestant churches, because like growing up, we did a non-denominational one. Then we were like with these liberal Mennonites, and then it was a Pentecostal church. It's not like any of these churches are like informal. where people are just like authentically, romantically expressing themselves. Like all these places have structure. And I don't know. To me, it's I can't rationally explain it. But I guess at the core of it, I felt like Catholicism or the Novus Ordo liturgy, whatever you want to call it, is less stifling than the vast majority of Protestant churches.
You know what I find is like when I go to a Protestant service, usually it's a funeral, I find it I become anxious because you never know what's going to happen next. Do you know what I mean? Like the person who's going to go up there to pray, you never know what they're going to do. Sometimes they'll do some kind of crazy, and everyone's also trying to hit it out of the park with every like little part of the service.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like if you are assigned to pray after this, or you try to do you try to make that the highlight of the service. And it's like, I feel like in the Catholic Church, you're just free to say, I know what's going to happen. I agree with what's happening. And I'm just going to like ride with this.
Right. Right. Which they will say is like dead ritual. But I would say I have a somewhat different perspective than you. Like insofar as because you never know exactly what's going to happen, it also kind of doesn't matter or whatever. Like, yeah, maybe this section will be over the top or underwhelming, but like then we just move on, just like at a Catholic liturgy, is where I kind of grew disillusioned with them.
I always felt like you see Catholics doing this now where they just want to judge every little part of the Mass. But I feel like when you're in a Protestant service, you almost are being asked to like evaluate every little part, because there's innovations and I don't know. Anyway, this is maybe just a not productive sidebar. But anyway, all right. Well, so you're attracted. Go ahead.
Part of it is I grew tired of having to like do those mental games, and Catholicism was like, no, here's a structure. Here's how it is. And it's like, yeah, seems okay.
Okay.
Whether that's selling out or true maturity, I think it's true maturity. What was your question before we...
Well, how did you end up wanting to become Catholic and finding the social doctrine and starting and essentially going from anarchist, organic farming commune to Catholic worker farm? And what's the difference?
For me, the main intellectual breakthrough was Nikolai Berdyaev, who Peter Morin and Dorothy Day read. He was really influential. He was part of he was an Orthodox Christian, and like the Soviets exiled him to Paris. And so he was in those like French personalist circles with Mounier and Maritain, and his Destiny of Man is probably the book that's most impacted me out of any book I've ever read. And that pushed me down this kind of Christian anarchist road where there is more of an emphasis in, well, at least they're like, ideally you're having mystical experiences, but also as an individual, how are you directly working with other people? It's a species of personalism, really. How do we take responsibility for ourselves and for other people? And how do we sort of model cruciform Christian love? So through Berdyaev, I was introduced, the ideas that like Larry Chapp is trying to popularize that they've been a kind of undercurrent even in Catholicism, and Morin and Day were about them. I was already there by kind of the middle of college.
Oh, you read him way back then?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But still I was like, well, I don't want to fully commit to, like papism. And so there was a gradual process of I kept going to Catholic masses. I kept reading about everything. I kept farming. And kind of the connecting thread externally between me and the Catholic worker movement was when COVID happened, our restaurant sales plummeted in March, April. And so I'd always known that there was a Catholic worker like literally 5 blocks away from the nonprofit that I worked at here in Kansas City. They had a big billboard, the Dorothy Day quote about when we break bread together, we're not alone anymore, and God is in the midst. And so we've finally kind of bridged that gap that I'd known it was like a line that I knew I could have crossed both to Catholicism and to the Catholic worker that was literally like 5 blocks away. And I was like intellectually exploring it, thinking about it, listening to podcasts, but I didn't really start making that jump until 2020, I would say. Now,
I want to get to where Emily kind of gets into this, but before that, you're mentioning anarchism a couple of times, like an anarchist farming co-op, but then there's also this Christian anarchism of this like Orthodox guy in Paris. That word still is got stigma and very misunderstood. How are you using that word, and what do you mean by that?
So etymologically, they say it has to do with like nomos in Greek, meaning like against norms and order. And so in most people's minds, what it means to be like against order is, bricks through ATMs and Starbucks windows and insurrectionary riots, Antifa, stuff like that. I mean it more in the sense of, I view it as a kind of hyper liberalism, in the sense that it's like we're liberal individuals. And how do we freely, as liberal individuals, organize ourselves and work together to constitute the social order from like the ground up or from the grassroots, instead of wanting some like macro political change. So that's more what it means. It's like individuals freely associating would be maybe a succinct way to sum.
Because of, meeting you guys recently, I've been thinking about this a little bit, and it seems like a lot of people I've known over my life who are interested in anarchist movements, I feel like they're not the same people who I would think really value family. Meaning like they're kind of in their 20s, they're a little bit divorced from that. They're trying to create this anarchist group of individuals, right? And I feel I've started to wonder, like, isn't the family kind of the ultimate anarchist group?
I'd say it's the fault line between anarchism and patriarchal authoritarianism. Is like it could go either way. It can be like a truly like holy, life-giving, nourishing society where everybody gives according to their capacity and receives according to their needs. Or it can be like an abusive nightmare. Okay.
Or another way to think about it might be like, there's authority and hierarchy within a family, but they also have to work out their own equilibrium. Sure. Like whoever's doing the chores, who's providing this, who's doing this, and that equilibrium could be kind of negative, or could be fair, or it could be the best thing in your life, but like in a true, I guess what you're maybe where I'm wrong in all this is like a true anarchist idea would be without the hierarchy. There would be no father figure or mother figure.
See, and that's where the devil is in the details. It's like how rigorously and rationalistically do you want to define your anarchism?
Right.
And if it's defined in this kind of whether you call it like hyper liberal or radical liberal, or I would dare to say like Tolstoyan sense, if I'm just an individual, then why would who should be free to do whatever I want at any time, then why would I ever make a commitment to marry someone else? Or what even gives, I would go far enough to say, what gives me the right to bring other humans into the world? So, I mean, that is one type of anarchist, but other anarchists will say, no, even true anarchism and everybody being free to be themselves, I mean, certain people will be higher or different functioning. And as long as we're individuals freely associating, and if everybody sees that Clark here is a better manager, then we are fine to elevate you as the manager of our collective because we're seeing who you are. But we have freely done that. We've kind of confirmed it instead of it's just been opposed by like arbitrary social norms. Is I think what they would say.
Yeah, I'm thinking of Dorothy Day right now, that like the Catholic worker movement is so kind of anarchistic in the sense that it doesn't seem like there's a good hierarchy that would keep certain houses from not getting off track or what, and you see that within the movement, there's a huge diversity of Catholic worker houses and farms that some are what any person could find one they love and any person could find one they hate. No matter where you are on the spectrum, right? But I remember Dorothy Day wrote something to the effect that like a mother or father of the house will arise as the person who's kind of sacrificed the most, and they'll naturally become the mother or father of that Catholic worker house, which I think is just kind of interesting, this idea that she's even pointing out that in this like anarchistic way, there's going to be these people who like rise up as like having more authority than others, within the community. But,
right. And I think yeah, there are lots of anarchists out there that can deal with that sort of thing.
And what's also interesting is, as a movement, this Catholic worker movement, that it gives people like you the opportunity to say, hey, we're going to take our faith super seriously. We're going to take this mission super seriously. And without doing a whole bunch of paperwork, you raise your flag and you plant your little farm.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah.
For better or worse.
For better or worse. Yeah. And usually both.
Right.
Yeah. And for whatever it's worth, I would just add, like, flowing from this Christian anarchism, which like Berdyaev's usually associated with that movement, as well as the Catholic workers, that can also flow the nonviolent stuff, because they're saying, okay, war's bad because we're like just blowing people up and like basically negating their human autonomy. And the way to do it isn't through more violence that's going to basically negate people's free agency. It's by sort of, in a cruciform way, surrendering my agency to invite the other people to also give up violence and try and freely associate with us and make a better world, is I think like the intellectual foundation for this type of stuff, for whatever that's worth.
So you had this seed all the way back, like before you started woofing, this kind of Catholic seed, right? When did you decide that? And you've discovered the Catholic worker. How did you and Emily meet? And then when did you guys decide that the Catholic social doctrine, becoming Catholic, was the right direction? Because the Catholic worker you were associated with actually, does it have no Catholics in it? Or what's the situation there? It's a kind of a strange Catholic worker, because I don't think it was founded by Catholics. It was, if I'm right, let me just throw this out. It was founded by maybe Presbyterians or something that needed a model to do what they wanted, and they could find nothing in their church, but they found the Catholic worker model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's accurate.
They're about to have one Catholic intern.
Well, they've had some seminarians before stay there, because I remember seeing them at Mass one day, and I'd be like, "What are you guys doing?" They're like, "We're at the Catholic Worker House." I'm like, "There's no Catholics there." They're like, "We know." So,
for a while the joke was that we were the most Catholic, even though like I was just going to RCIA, and Emily hadn't begun that yet.
Yeah, we weren't even Catholic. Yeah.
But so how we met?
We met back in early 2020. My former roommate and I were looking for an apartment, and we ran into Spencer's aunt. So we signed a lease for her apartment, and there was one day she was just getting to know us, and I had mentioned just like my interest in environmentalism and farming and wanting to get involved in the local scene here. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, my nephew does that in Kansas City." And so one day we kind of met up for a tour at the nonprofit that he was working for, and eventually me at the time. And I just kind of offered free labor. I was in this mixed of COVID was just like restrictions were just starting to unfold a little bit. And I was kind of in this mix of like, I'd left the climate organization that I was with a few months before. And I was kind of in this like limbo of, I was looking for something, but didn't know that I was looking, but like kind of fell into it, I guess. I don't know. I'm doing a poor job of explaining it, but.
No. And then pretty soon after, we started volunteering at the Catholic Worker.
Yeah. Within probably just a couple months, because that was at the same time we were trying to offer them lettuce, because all these restaurants were closed down. There was a bunch of lettuce. We had nowhere for it to go besides compost. So we had offered to give them some. They didn't want the lettuce, but they did need help. So then we kind of started our volunteer ministry with them.
Do you have a background in Christianity or Catholicism?
No, I was raised, I don't even totally like saying this because we're not active in the church really, but I was raised Mormon, like LDS. But just as there's like C&E Catholics, we were kind of like C&E Mormons. I'm not a good representation of what it was like to grow up Mormon, I guess, which is where I don't always feel comfortable saying it because I'm not like, I don't know.
And then in college, you did some evangelical
I did do some evangelical stuff because I did still have this like desire or need knowing that like there is like God, there is this authority greater than me, but I had no idea where to look. I was like stuck in these like very left liberal activist circles, which did not promote Christianity or like nor wanted to talk about it. So I was this like kind of like closeted, didn't know where to go Christian.
That's great. When you and Spencer started meeting and comparing ideas, were you attending church anywhere, or were you just kind of like, that was just a background thing?
That was just a background thing. The last church that I had attended was like some non-denominational church in college. But at this time, too, a lot of the churches were either closed down on Zoom or something like that. So even for me, like the will to go or try to seek those things out was even less of I don't know.
And when did you, because I don't remember this, when did you start coming to Mass with me?
I think it was right as we started dating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which would have been, we started dating like a year after we met.
Yeah.
So where Emily is like a super trooper is she kept coming and working like a lot for free. As like everybody else left, it was literally just me. So like I have no idea where I would be if she hadn't come along.
When you say come working your current farm, or come working like the nonprofit you were working at before that?
Both. Because at the time that I came around, he had just bought this property that we're at now. So it was kind of this mix of like, we're got to keep the nonprofit alive, and we're also starting this. So
I kind of want to throw out some quips, even though it's not really on our topic, but like, were you LDS, or were you this schismatic Mormon group that's based out of Kansas City?
LDS.
So just for our listeners, in Kansas City, I believe that this is the historic Garden of Eden of Mormonism. And there's a schismatic group. And usually when you say schismatic Mormon, that's very much a pejorative because it means they're still polygamous or whatever. But this group broke from the Mormons before they left for Utah. And if you go Google the Great Mormon War, it all happened here in Kansas City, the Great Mormon War. About 20 people died in the Great Mormon War, just so you know. But like, anyway, a lot of local Mormon history here in Kansas City.
Yeah.
All right. So, all right, you guys meet, you're comparing ideas. At what point do you think we need to become Catholic and we need to start a Catholic worker?
So I would say we got in, I met Emily in like spring of 2020, COVID's happening. By fall of 2020, we're regularly volunteering at Cherith. And I started reading Peter Morin. Like I'd read a little bit of Day in college, but she wasn't nearly as appealing to me as like Berdyaev. And so I'm reading Peter Morin, and I'm coming to it through like, I've already basically accepted Berdyaev's worldview. And so I'm like, okay, this is how you would more or less, I mean, he's not like really nuts and bolts, but he's more nuts and bolts than these like more idealistic abstract philosophers. So I'm like, okay, this is like a plan to try and realize Christian anarchism, or try and reconstruct a Christian social order. So I like respected him on that level. And then through him, I started reading some Day and more about the Catholic worker movement. And through that, I was exposed to, a big part of what they're about is Catholic social teaching, distributism, third way type of stuff. What Marxists deride as utopian socialism. And so through that, I was exposed to Catholic social teaching, and coming to it like from a more left-wing perspective. It's like, oh, this is a way to like be resolutely Catholic and still want to create a radically better and different than we have social order if we were to really carry these ideas out. And so for me, the bridge was the Catholic, like more in Catholic social teaching. And then it's like, well, I've already been going to the liturgy for like 5 years. So if I can get over these last hurdles about papal primacy, and, like accepting the authority of ecumenical councils and things like this, which compared to everything else I've had to traverse wasn't that much. That's what it looked like for me. And so I started going to RCIA in the February of last year. And so it was like a 6-month journey from RCIA there to getting confirmed.
Spencer, where did you go to RCIA at?
The cathedral here in KCMO.
Oh, right.
Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. Right. Because my parish, they only do Spanish masses. So,
Emily, what was your journey like?
Well, throughout all this, Spencer is telling me what's going on. So like he makes a very convincing argument. And as we're also trying to like live out in our own way, this like practicality of I don't know, Catholic worker, not Catholic worker. We weren't Catholic workers at the time, we wouldn't say, but like that is functionally what we were trying to do. So it was, for me, well, at least like switch in my direction is like, we're having, Spencer and I are like working together multiple days a week. We're having all these like discussions about, I don't know, how are we changing our lives and the people around us? I've been exposed to Cherith Brook. And for me, what was like really helpful about Cherith Brook, the Catholic worker there, was honestly like being exposed to such intimate relationships with the poor that like really changed my life in a number of ways. And so for me, that was like a big turning point in like taking the church seriously, taking Christianity more seriously, and also still reading up on like Catholic workerhood and Catholicism was kind of my route. But yeah, some big things for me, less the intellectual stuff for him, but mine was more of like this like divine mercy message, this and so on. And this like, how do we radically take care of the people that are living in our midst, I guess. And it's less so like this big, let's just put them all in, I don't know, homeless shelters or whatever, but like, let's like figure out how to house them and like actually know their names. And I don't know, this more intimate relationship was like, I'm doing, again, sorry, a poor job of explaining, but
I think you're doing a good job. So the Catholic worker movement has like two prongs, right? It has these houses of hospitality, which are doing exactly what you're saying, like this loving personal responsibility, you know, embracing of the poor, right? And then there's the Catholic worker farms, which I've seen managed a variety of ways, sometimes also doing hospitality. But like, so you kind of found the gold in the Catholic worker in the houses of hospitality, and now you're moving to more a farm model, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And in part, we tried to bring some of the farming into that Catholic worker, and we're basically rebuffed. And we're like, but we still think the farming's really important.
Yeah.
And we've got a farm from Mort Collective. And so right around the time I got confirmed, like our relationship at Cherith was under a fair amount of tension. And then it's like, well, are we serious about Catholic workerhood still? Mm-hmm. And then if we are, it makes sense to some extent reconceptualize our project. But we were already, I would argue, like 80+% Catholic worker.
Yeah.
And so that's where we named it John Paul II, because Emily's really into St. Faustina, Divine Mercy. And I am as well. Mm-hmm. And, you know, he did a lot of the social teaching that brought us in.
What do you love about St. Faustina, Emily?
Well, I kind of resonate with her she's like this like uneducated, you know, simple woman, I guess, but like her faith is just so rich and so deep and so intimate with Jesus. And so that's just something that I've always admired and wanted to like kind of pursue. Like my life of holiness is like, how do I have this like intimate relationship with Jesus, but also with like the poor around me, the people around me, I don't know, things like that. And also I think this divine mercy message too, for me, brings like a certain amount of like a humbling hope, I guess, of like, hopefully that even though no matter where society goes in terms of like climate change or these other looming economic crises in the background, that like we have God and we have his like infinite mercy and everything like that. So that gives me a lot of hope, and I guess keeps me going throughout everything we're doing.
And did you come into the church last Easter?
This Easter,
right. Okay. Now you're both working on this Catholic worker farm project. What are your goals, or what do you feel like is the focus of this?
Well, we're still marinating on like, what is our very defined, concrete mission? Mm-hmm. But in a broader sense, what we want to do is hopefully acquire a few more houses, get better at growing food across the street, and be able to offer hospitality either to like to guests, whether it's traveling through Catholic workers, or if we know someone who has like a personal connection with somebody who's really in need, if we could house them. Mm-hmm. And basically have a kind of like eco commune, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
Where we can be growing You know, if we could be growing 10 to 30% of our food, that would be great.
10% or 30% of your food, or like, is that a goal for society that you just said?
More for ours.
For us, yeah.
But
Okay.
part of what we would like to demonstrate, and where where we overlap with the Morin Academy's teaching mission, is we would like to demonstrate that, like, hey, you don't have to go as far as a lot of the Catholic workers do to be doing a Catholic worker project.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think part of, at least my problem with a decent amount of the Catholic worker movement is, it seems to me there's like a hyper Franciscanism, and it overlaps with that anarchism, where it's like, we're just going to live in like total poverty. You know, we're just going to find a homeless person on the street and bring them in. And I'm not going to say there's no value to that, but what it does is it sets up this boundary between normal people, the laity, where they can't imagine doing that. But we're like, well, couldn't you befriend your neighbors, and somebody does chickens and a few other people help out with the gardens, and this won't solve all the problems, but it will somewhat reduce your dependency on the industrial agricultural system, and it will create the basis for a genuine community. And so at the bigger abstract level, that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish.
Now, both of you were coming out of movements that were kind of apocalyptic, right? And I almost like we make fun of baby boomers sometimes, like as they get old, becoming doomers. But like this apocalyptic vision when you're young is also kind of like being a doomer. Like you just see the whole world go down the toilet, environmentally or agriculturally or what, right?
Socially, politically.
Yeah.
Now that you've gone through this travel and arrived as Catholic workers in the Catholic Church, are you still doomers? Are you still like apocalyptic like that? Or is it or is there more like, because like when you say your goals, it's like, maybe we can help people be a little better. Well, that doesn't solve the apocalypse.
No.
But it's still good. It's good. Like, is the weight of the apocalypse still on your Catholic worker farm?
I would say it's a little less, but I mean, it's still in the air.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's no like, Jesus will handle the apocalypse. We just got to make people, love each other a little bit better, or grow a little bit of their own veggies.
I'd say that's like the baseline, and then we're hoping for more. But
okay.
But we have been chastened by what seems to be possible.
Mm-hmm.
Joel Salatin, who's a kind of organic farming guru, he wrote a book called "Everything I Want to Do Is Illegal," and it's this like libertarian screed against basically governmental regulation. And maybe one day I would like to write a kind of spiritual successor called "Everything I Want to Do Is Socially and Financially Impossible," because I see, and to me, it's pretty clear, it's in these encyclicals. The popes are saying, if you reorganize your lives and work together, you could really create a better society along all sorts of ways, where there's more equitable distribution of property, where we're taking better care of the environment, where we're better realizing our potential as individuals than humans. And it would be more humane to animals, which isn't for me has never been like the core thing, but it would be nice if we could not abuse the animals. You could be doing that, but you would have to reject a bunch of temptations and systems of sin that we're deeply implicated in. I guess that's what I would say. So
I kind of want to springboard from that into a bigger conversation, because we've gotten all the way to where you guys are now Catholic workers. You're starting your project and you're trying to come up with realistic goals, but you're still dreaming big, right? So what I like about your podcast, which how about you tell everyone what your podcast is and how to find it?
So Laurie and I have a podcast that's under the Morin Academy umbrella called Dustbowl Diatribes. Currently, Spotify won't let us on, but you can find us on YouTube and Apple Music.
Are you too subversive for Spotify?
Well, we had too much music, so I guess so. We had too much music, and they thought we were like distributing it or something, and now we like can't talk to someone to like work it out. Okay. I guess.
Well, I mean, it's good to be banned. It helps your following to be banned from something.
I like to think Joe Rogan was like, I don't want the competition. I can't take the heat. But yeah, so the point of it is that modernity is kind of like a giant dust bowl where there's all sorts of things are just being swirled around. There's a lot of chaos. We don't know what to do. We're worried climate change is out of control. And so what do we do? and what do people think is happening? So we interview people from, like we just interviewed a Marxist, we interviewed Larry Chapp, basically asking for people's diatribes and what they think should be done. And especially what are they doing in their own lives to try and do something. And if people are interested in more collective, we did a 2-part, like in agonizing detail about how that project started and failed.
So what was the Mort Collective?
That was the anarchistic group that I started with my friends that died and turned into JPII. Yeah.
So what I find very endearing about your podcast is like, I found at the beginning of Simple House that there's a lot of ideas. And there's a lot of ideas about serving the poor, about how you should live and be holy. And these ideas are often like what you come up with. I always think of like while laying in the bed, waiting to fall asleep at night, or you're reading something, you get all jazzed up about some idea. But these ideas have to be taken to reality. And sometimes reality has a lot of tension with these ideas, right? And you have this choice of either lying to yourself, that, reality is conforming to your ideas, or you have to, or you have to think that reality is just greatly flawed because it doesn't conform to the, ideal that you have. Or you have to think, maybe reality is also a source of information from God. Maybe reality is what it should be. And I have to actually change my ideas to fit reality, And I feel like this is kind of the tension of going from utopian to real, right? In my very kind of nerdy Catholic way, I was always thinking like, here are the sources of truth. The sources of truth are scripture, sacred tradition. Those are the 2 pillars of kind of dogma in the Catholic Church, right? And then you can also get some truth directly from God, divine revelation. And you can also get truth from literally the reality that God put you in and that you're enmeshed in, right? Except the only problem with that one is, there's been the fall.
Right. So everything's mixed.
So it is mixed, but is it more like the John Calvin fall, or is it more like the Catholic fall? Like, is reality just, horribly harmed because it's just so bad? Or is it that like reality is base good with a little bit of like disease in it? Mm-hmm. A little bit of problem in it, right? And I go with the reality is base good with a little bit of problem in it. And if my ideas, and sometimes my ideas aren't good enough for reality. It's like I see this all the time. I'm sorry, now I'm talking too much, but like young people who are dating, sometimes they won't have almost ever dated anyone, and they'll have a very defined idea of what a man is or what a woman is and what romance is and what marriage should be, right? And it's not based on reality. It's based on just like what they thought up or what they read, right? And I can tell you that like men and women are way better than any idea you have of men and women. Right. So if your idea meets men or women and it's found that men and women are different than your idea, you need to like be more creative with your idea and not condemn all men or condemn all women.
Sure.
So anyway, long way of saying, I feel like it's so interesting to listen to your podcast because I see that you're struggling with this idea of we have this utopian vision that's not meeting reality. How do we do better, either improve our vision or improve our aims, our means to achieve our vision. And then you're inviting on kind of people also with this utopian vision, but it seems like you're trying to get them to become more real or to and it's very hard.
Sure. Yeah. Or part of me, the utopian in me is secretly hoping they're going to say something that will just allow us to realize that maybe they've just taken it one intellectual step farther where finally it all fits together.
Like a keystone, like somehow they'll put the Jesus keystone on this arch and you'll bridge to utopia or something,
Right. So we try and do both.
Yeah. And I want to yell at the people on your podcast.
Yeah.
And you're doing a good job. There's another podcast I really like where the guy has a very strong ideology, but when he invites guests on, he just gives them the floor and he'll poke them a little bit, but he's not trying to win them to his ideology each time, And I feel like you're doing a good job of letting your guests really express what they feel like is the truth, But then whenever you ask a question, you're trying to pull them back to the real. And I just wish you almost would hammer them with the question, because I want them to be confronted with the real and not be this utopian.
Mm-hmm. Well, and maybe we're getting gruffer as we go on, I think, as our patience grows thinner and thinner. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and part of what it is it's hard for, especially like if you're the type of person that we've selected to like, ask you questions on a podcast. It is probably because you are a more intellectual person who's making arguments out there on the internet or in books that we've heard, and we're interested in those ideas. And we've tried to do a bit like with Farmer Dan and then with my aunt, more on the ground people who are doing less of the thinking and more of the doing. Which what you usually find is those in their own ways aren't the best interviews, because they're usually not super self-critical about what they're doing. They're just doing it, and they tend not to be as eloquent about what they think. But with the intellectuals, I think there's a specific kind of disease, and I think it's worse if you're like either a professional intellectual or an academic, because it's like you have been so ingrained by the point of writing this essay is to get a good grade and then to write more essays. And I think because they tend to exist, for lack of a better term, in an ivory tower, there's even less of a pull towards reality, because they're like, what do you mean? The reality is I got to write another book because that's my job.
Right. There has been this rise, like I feel like in the last 20 years, anyone who was a public intellectual who was not an academic was kind of a pseudo-intellectual. And now I feel like there's tons of people with interesting thoughts who are not in academia, and they all have platforms, like with this rise of social media. And it's created this whole other type of intellectual, which I enjoy more, frankly, than an academic, but,
well, and that to me, it seems like it cuts both ways, because they're less bound by like professional strictures, but they're more bound by like market feedback.
Right.
And then there's this incentive to just aim for that lowest common denominator.
Right. So help me with this. So I'm having a problem. I'm becoming kind of anti-utopian, right? Like there's a number of people who I'm like, I would value your opinion on any policy. Like if I became president of the United States or mayor, any type of authority, I would love you to come in and comment on everything that comes across the desk. Right. But as soon as I ask you to tell me your vision, you totally lose me.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like your vision just seems so incomplete and so untethered and so not corrected by what you're watching happen, or so experimental. Like there's like this, we already said this on our podcast a bit ago, but like we have a friend who like during the kind of Black Lives Matter movement came up with this like community policing model, right? And he wasn't the one who came up with it, but he was telling me about it. And I was like, that's wonderful. Like that actually sounds beautiful. And if that works, that would be the best. Right. So how about we try it in like, a few neighborhoods, a few small contained areas. And then if it works well, let's try to scale it up maybe to 10x that. So you could like deal with scaling problems. Right. But the desire is not to do that. The desire is to take the whole city, throw the police out and go straight to this other new thing.
Sure.
Which I feel like is the way communist countries get themselves in trouble and cause famines, is they just are like, let's reinvent the whole thing right away. You know what I mean? And then you find out reality isn't quite what you thought, and now you're in trouble. Right.
Sure.
I'm sorry. You're just getting my rant without any good substance here. But I feel like there's a lot of armchair quarterbacking where it's like you want to like reinvent the whole church or reinvent the whole economy. And I feel like what you guys are doing, just doing this like more modest goal, makes sense. And then if it works well, then you multiply it and try to get it to go viral.
Yeah. I wonder to what extent, you were talking about your mom and none of her siblings wanted to stay on the farm.
Right.
I mean, there's two ways you can look at that. There's to what extent is that actual human nature, whether made by God or corrupted by original sin? To what extent is it our nature? And to what extent is it like nurtured, like culturally inculcated? Can
I add something to that? Sure. I also see this idea, even amongst my mom's siblings who are now in their 70s, that like they went from like everything organic, everything natural, right? And all the bread baked at home to Wonder Bread, to back to Whole Foods bread, Do you know what I mean? But there was a point in which they thought Wonder Bread was an improvement over like what they would grew up with. That's a fairly extreme thing. I'm not sure Wonder Bread is exactly what they thought was an improvement, but there's a sense in which they thought like I had a friend in college who did a project. He was a history major on like advertising, and he was showing advertising from the 30s and 40s. And it was always advertising uniformity. Like, we're going to sell you charcoal. It's always the exact same size brick. They would put that in the ad, right? And then advertising today is all about not like trying to pretend it's not uniformity.
Sure. It's different. It's directed to you, and you are a very unique individual for seeing the value in this product.
Right. But there was a thing in my mom's generation, the one that left the farm, that they wanted the uniformity. They wanted the Wonder Bread that tasted the same each time and not the more organic bread.
Right.
You know?
Yep. And for me, the question is, to what extent is this our actual nature? And to what extent is this conditioned by whatever phase of like economic development and like the political cultural ideas swirling around?
Right. Because the fact that they went back to wanting the organic is important too, you know, and it feels like it was a moment in history, you know?
Yeah. And people have, Michael Pollen talks about there's this cyclical thing. Like, we did the same thing with rice. For a while, white rice was seen as superior. And in the 60s, everything brown, if you were part of the counterculture, brown things were better. So brown rice, brown bread. And before, that was only the poor people could afford to eat the non-white bread. So there is this cyclical, it's why I still think capitalism is a permanent revolution, because we do these things where what's cool is old and it goes round and round. I wonder to what extent, if this isn't just nurture, if it is human nature, to what extent is it we have a kind of yearning for more, for the infinite, the God-shaped hole. And to what extent we fill that by, well, I could at least get out of this little podunk town. At least I can go to the city and see plays and eat the Wonder Bread. And it is this, and I'm trying to connect it to, what if we just got all the cops out of town? I increasingly think it is an unwillingness to like live in reality and accept responsibility for what you have, and to kind of scale up towards maybe the more utopian things that we would like to do or should be done. But it's not nearly as fun to actually have to grind to make those changes and accept all the compromises life will force from you on the way. And so it's more fun to like get on the internet and say, yeah, we should get rid of the cops. They shouldn't have shot that kid. I guess that's what I would say. And as well, the kernel inside of that I think is true is, at some point, if we do want to create a different, better world, and I would say if we want to create the world that the popes have been calling for in these encyclicals, you are at some point talking about a major macro political and economic change, however that would happen.
So I think I'm following you, and I think I believe that, like, sometimes when we go utopian, it's actually a dodge. It's actually like a way to not deal with what's right in front of you, and I see that, and I kind of believe that. And I think that, I see this in a lot of statements that get passed around Catholicism, like everything. These are kind of different political spheres where these statements are, but like one would be like, it's our job to build the kingdom of God here on earth. Another statement would be like, the Eucharist is the source and summit of our faith, and that makes you very liturgically focused. The other statement about building the kingdom of God on earth makes you very politically focused and economically focused, right? And then when you like actually just look at Jesus, it doesn't seem like either of those statements are consuming his time and work, right? And I'm not sure that either of those statements are what led to the great evangelization of the first 500 years of Christianity. It seems like the real work, the primary work of the church, always is the complete transformation of a person, in relationship with God. It's psychological. It's spiritual transformation. It's relationship, but relationship first with God and everyone else, because there's no separation between that, in a sense, right? And I feel like when you make, it about like building a kingdom of God here on earth, you're actually not doing that harder work, or it gives you a way not to focus on the harder work. which is the transformation of yourself in a sense. And it's not even work because it's not something you necessarily can do. It's something that happens that you participate in, you know. But like, I think there's a mystery here where it's all like a big dodge, you know, but it's not wrong. It's like building the kingdom of God here on earth is a good day job, you know, like, and same with like working on liturgical, whatever, it can be a good day job. It just can't be the essence, you know?
I agree. Yeah. And that's part of what has pulled us towards Catholic workerhood is how do you try and do, you know, it used to be called like Catholic action. That how do we take the stuff that's in sacred church or, you know, in the deposit of faith, in the liturgy, how do we use that or take that to like sanctify the temporal order?
You know, one place I kind of seem to be differing from you is that like when you're talking about like the social doctrine of the church or the social teaching of the church, I've always found it to be very vague. You know, like you should care about the environment more. You should care about the worker or your fellow man more. You should do this more. And I find it very much, so in a way, it's not that utopian because it's not like saying, here's the perfect society and you need to figure out how to get from here to there. It's much more like, these are valid concerns. These are valid values, and you should prioritize these more than we are now. But like, I stop short of thinking, oh, and there's an obvious plan.
Yeah. And a lot of its proponents will say that's its strengths, is that the very, like, for lack of a better term, vagueness and ambiguity of it, in the sense that, yeah, it's giving you these more abstract ideals, allows it to be applied prudentially in specific situations.
Yes. And I think it's a huge door open for the laity that's who needs to do that work. You know, like if there's going to be less war or there's going to be a better environment or there's going to be like better, healthier immigration policies, this is not the Pope who's going to tell you exactly how to implement it in your community, right. You know, because it'd be a disaster if they did. Right. But I also think there's also this thing always in the social doctrine where everything is counterbalanced. You know, like they'll say immigration. Well, here's some valid reasons to not let, you know, have, you know, immigration 300% the size of your total population. And here's some valid reasons why you should have some immigration, you know, and it's kind of hard to like make it. It's very much not, I guess it's not utopian in my mind, you know, because it's not saying here's the perfect way. It's saying like, here's some valid motivations. Here's some valid motivations here. Now, if you're just xenophobically afraid, that doesn't fit in with our valid motivations.
Yeah. Or another example, I was just reviewing Centesimus Annus 42, where JPII says, you know, the church supports capitalism if by capitalism is meant, you know, things like markets, basically private ownership. But the church does not if what is meant is basically like absolute free market, no regulations. And for me, I guess my pushback would be, you're right that it's counterbalanced, it's vague. I'm calling it vague. But to me, then where there's an opening for a dodge that I would accuse the church en masse of doing is then saying, because it's vague, there's no standard, because it's open to whatever, then who interprets its application? And then since there isn't a Catholic either social movement or political party that has any meaningful power, from what I can tell, then you're just like an identity politics interest group within like the Republican Party or the Democrat Party. There's factions on both sides. And then the whole thing's off the table because what it turns into is, well, we should have vaguely pro-immigrant attitudes.
I think that's right. And I don't know any solution to that, though. Like, because like I've seen like the bishop, it's wrong to say that the bishops never stand up for anything, you know, but it's also true to say that when they do stand up, it doesn't always go that well. You know, like, for example, here in Kansas City, there was a stem cell research place. It's down near the plaza called the Stower Institute. And they passed a state amendment. It's been about 10 years ago now, that was basically allowing human cloning. Right. But they had worded it in a weird way, like the state amendment to the Constitution to ban human cloning. But then if you read it, it was actually the reverse of what the title was. Right. So the Catholic Church just went to war on this. You know what I mean? Like the Bishop of Kansas City and St. Louis, different Catholic celebrities they were doing commercials on TV all the time on this issue. trying to win this one issue at the state level, right? And they lost, right? Similarly, like the Catholic Church pushed hard for kind of the Obama healthcare reform, you know, and then immediately that political structure turned against them and said, let's include abortion and contraception, everything as part of this healthcare reform. Right. And I think that's an underrated moment in history where the Catholic Church and the Democratic Party like really parted ways, you know, because they'd worked so hard to push for something that needed pushed, and the Democratic Party needed them. And then they got kind of betrayed within 6 months, you know. And once again, coming back to this idea that the first and foremost thing is the transformation of the person, which I think every bishop, that's their first and foremost job, right? And then their second job is also fight human cloning or something like that, you know? Yeah, or abortion or the environment or nuclear weapons or any of these issues where they have to prudentially like pick one because you don't have infinite, you know, political capital. You know, you can't write a, you know, thing on all these things, right? And I don't know how much more they should do. Like, in a way, I think the problem that all Catholics have and people outside the church have is everyone who looks at the church, both inside and out, believes that this is the most top-down thing they've ever seen. You know, it just looks like an incredibly top-down structure. But I really think that the Catholic Church is much more a grassroots anarchistic structure than a top-down structure. And that the top, the Pope and the bishops and the archbishops and the cardinals are much more about pastoring in the sense of like, hey, here's my sheep. That one went way too far that way. Bring him back. I think they do as more of that work than shoving all the sheep in, like saying, hey, people, we're going to rally around the environment. You do this, you do this, you do this. Let's go. Right. It's much more like you guys start a Catholic worker farm about the environment. And if it gets any traction, you know, you'll end up getting a little bit of support. Or if you don't get support, maybe that's prophetic witness too. But it stamps out the things that end up becoming anti-Catholic, but it doesn't so much launch and brainstorm all the other good things. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Like it has to just start from the laity, and potentially that will sort of grow.
And this is even how saints are made. Like a cult arises around someone and the church judges the cult. The church doesn't find someone and say, hey, this person was a saint. They wait to see, hey, what happened here? Does this person have people who are very devoted to their teachings or ideas or their person? Is there a cult around this thing that seems healthy? And then they just judge that and they end up declaring the person a saint. But it was much more like a bottom pushed it up than a top pushed it down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, which I think is very freeing, but also puts a huge amount of responsibility on the laity that the laity don't always want.
Yeah.
And I, like in the early days of Simple House, I had people come and ask, what gave me the permission to do this? You know, and all we were was helping the poor and trying to spread the good news of Christ. Like really nothing. I mean, I just kind of thought the universal call of holiness, like, isn't this a well duh? You know, like how could you, like, we're all supposed to be doing this. This is just trying to do it. You know, I mean, I don't need permission. The permission is universally granted already. Right. But people would ask me what gave me. And so I ended up going to the diocese and going in DC and going, people are asking me if I have a charter or permission or like, if you guys can like endorse this, you know, and like say that I'm allowed to come be a missionary and help, you know, just feed people and, you know, be Christian. And the guy goes, that's an interesting question. And the person I talked to was the director of evangelization for the diocese. Had him over for lunch. And I said, hey, this is a problem. Right. And he goes, okay. And I go like, and he goes, what exactly do you want? I go like, is there something you can get me where I can like frame it and put on the wall saying we have permission to operate or like you endorse this or that? And he goes, okay. And then he like leaves and he like comes back and he goes, all right, Clark, you know me, right? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, all right, that's your relationship with the diocese.
Yeah. A kind of personalism.
Yeah.
Well, it also is the only relationship you can have, because otherwise you're asking the diocese to bless all these things that could go up in scandal, you know? And the way they test things is they let the lay people do things. And then if it gets too out of hand, they intervene. If it doesn't get out of hand, they bless it at some point. But even then it's a limited blessing because it could get shut down later, but
as modern liberal people that have absorbed ideas of like state power and bureaucracy, I think we have reprojected that onto the Catholic Church. And I guess I hear you saying it's another way we block actually looking at how this institution in particular functions. That we think it's like an international nation state, basically.
Yeah, but even healthy nation states don't operate that way. It's like it wasn't like the U.S. government, decided we need a social media industry. I mean, like these things just organically develop and then they get regulated, right? And I think that's the way the church is supposed to be too.
Yeah. Well, then I get my question to you would be, as far as I know, we are the only Catholic worker in the KC metro area. Why us? Out of hundreds of thousands of Catholics.
Meaning like, why did God call you to do it? Or what do you mean, why us?
Why are we the first?
Well, because we always suck. No, but I mean, like, why did Simple House need to start going door to door or start like just meeting with people in the projects? Shouldn't we all have been doing that? Or like, why was there a need to actually have a little, organized effort to do it? And part of the thing is like one of the things when I listen to your organic farming content or whatever, it's like, yes, food is very foundational to man. Our relationship with the land is very foundational to man. So is security. So is like my kids' education. So is like the home life. So it's like it's not, it might have certain unique properties and it is very important, but there's actually a lot of things to work on, And like when we think of like these like things where people band together as church and build something, like every Catholic school is kind of an amazing achievement, of the community banding together and building it. And some of them end up kind of sucking, but it's like still kind of that creativity always needs to be coming from the laity. And you guys are working on one aspect of the work, and you guys might be standing in the gap, meaning like, no one else is standing there and you guys have to be our representatives to go die for the good of the city, because like the standing in the gap's like there's a hole in the castle wall. And at that one hole, some guy can stand in that gap and hold off the invading army while people are building the wall behind them. You know what I mean? And there was a way in which I felt like that at Simple House, that like all the religious orders had kind of, except for the Missionaries of Charity, had kind of moved up to this like more cozy part of DC, not with the poor. And like, we were like down in Southeast DC and there was like no other religious order besides the Missionaries of Charity down there. We aren't a religious order, but there was no other like Catholic, missionary effort going on in the most poor part of town. You know what I mean? And I felt like we need to be here so people don't give the LDS, the Mormons, all the credit for doing this and say the Catholic Church doesn't actually do any mission work. You know what I mean? I was like, even if we do a bad job, we at least just need to exist because it's important we exist, I don't know. I think that's where you guys are at too, and it is interesting. You're the only Catholic worker, but you're not the first. There's been multiple Catholic workers in Kansas City that have like been born and faded over the years. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think things have their time, and there's a new energy that's always good, but to give you another kind of what I think is a compliment is like, I've had friends like in the organic food kind of movement, very idealistic, and they all burn out like at 30 or something, and then they kind of rejoin what you might think as mainstream society. They probably still buy a little bit more food from the farmer's market than most, but they're no longer as dedicated. They're not like, they got drained of their energy, right? And they learned some lessons. But I don't see like this, it's almost like the previous generation of hippie burnout needs to write some best practices for the next generation so that each generation starts one step ahead of the last, and there's a sense in which you guys are trying to do that in your podcast. I hear, like you're trying to say, hey, can we do a postmortem on this, like where this went wrong, but I also think as Catholic workers, you guys have this new energy right now and this like opportunity to like really set your agenda, whereas if you go into any Catholic workhouse that's 10 years old, even, there's already going to be a normal way of doing things. There's already going to be a normal agenda. They're already going to be in an equilibrium that's going to be hard to break out of to get to a better equilibrium.
We found that.
Right. But there also needs to be this like lessons learned so that you guys don't, invite 10 homeless guys to move in and end up exactly like the previous experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was an old line in part of the 60s counterculture. There was a line about don't trust anyone over 30. And it sets you up to not learn from your elders. And I think it's one more example of the Dust Bowl of modernity that, Edmund Burke talked about how if you bust tradition, we'll all be flies of a summer was his term. You won't have intergenerational continuity of knowledge, practices, property ownership. And I guess in an even more abstract than what we're trying to do at JPII, we're trying to like scream that like we need to reestablish these ties, like religio. They say one of the roots of Latin in Latin for religio meant to bind together. And I don't know, we're trying to do our part.
Why is your like title Dust Bowl of modernity, or not that Dustbowl Diatribes is the title, but this idea of the Dust Bowl of modernity, why isn't that just kind of too doomer in some sense, kind of like the way John Calvin is about humans?
The theory I would put forward is we should be more doomerish now than in the past, insofar as, which is not to say that there isn't actually unprecedented possibilities for good things to happen. I think that's true. I think we're living in, there was a Marxist historian who wrote a history of the 20th century and he called it the age of extremes. I think we're still living through these extreme times where there is extreme good potential. But if we don't take hold of those possibilities, they will not happen automatically, which cuts against, I think 25 to 80% of people, we have this underlying Whig theory of history that's progressive. And we deeply want to believe that things are on the whole going to keep getting better, that history is like a giant escalator. And because it's this dodge of saying we don't have to take responsibility for ourselves, for each other, and for history. And part of where we are still doomerish is we're saying if we don't take responsibility, if we don't seriously try and incarnate these values being talked about in the social encyclicals and in Christ's teaching, the planet's going to keep getting hotter. Soil's going to keep blowing off. The oceans are going to get more acidified. There's going to be more and more microplastics building up in all of us. And so there is a doomer aspect of it, but kind of like we're doing a course on Romano Guardini's End of the Modern World. He's saying as well, we still have human agency. We still have grace sanctifying us to allow us to conquer the situation or at least mitigate it. And what Laurie and I see, and Emily too, is like a widespread collective default is our position. Now, maybe that's too bleak. Maybe there's all sorts of wildflowers growing and I'm blind to them because I have my head in the cloud.
One of the things that I thought was very honest is when I met Laurie and we were all talking, and it was about like, I know there's got to be people who listen to our podcast who don't agree with global warming and whatever, but like, if you do believe in global warming, like, is it even stoppable? What I mean? Like, or does it require almost a miracle of human cooperation to stop? That's just like we don't see that miracle happening, and it already needed to happen yesterday, not tomorrow, And
right.
So then it's like, because a frustration I've had with global warming people is that it's like, I see no solution in what you're saying. You're very doomer, but without any real solution that I can see. So the next logical thing is mitigation. Like, let's go build a seawall in Miami. Let's not keep talking about an impossible international treaty, And I felt like you guys kind of have that attitude too, that part of your local farming idea is that we need this for the sake of resiliency so that when things do go bad, we have this like mitigating thing. Like the bad won't be as bad if we do this.
Right.
Am I right in that? Or
and also that hopefully at that point we've planted a seed in other people that they can at least know how to grow 5% of their food whenever the
100%. Yeah.
Good. Like, yeah.
And I feel like anyone who didn't get alarmed about that during COVID, you know, when they saw supply chain problems and we only had like just-in-time inventory going on, like it's just wild that people weren't alarmed about that. And I became very alarmed with volcanoes. Like I was like, you're talking about global warming, but like there've been volcanoes that wipe out growing seasons, and I don't know what's going to happen to modern man if we lose one growing season.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because like the last time it happened would have been like early 1800s, and it's like when that happened, most people were on the farm, most people had a cow, most people had like some meat on the hoof and corn seed for the next crop, and they had like in a sense they all were preppers.
Sure.
You know, and now it's like we are way operating with a thinner safety net, you know what I mean, for disruption.
Yeah, I think in the podcast with Dan Kroll, he had mentioned, which I'd need to fact check this, but like Kansas City and probably similar other cities only has like 3 days worth of food.
That sounds reasonable. Yeah. And I think most families have about that, maybe 6 days if you count. There's 3 days of food at the grocery store and 3 days of food in your pantry. So maybe you got 6 days, you know, but it's unlikely that all food stops at once. But either way, we're living with a very thin safety net on our civilization, you know, and what you guys are working on is one way to have a little bit of an insurance policy, you know, but why did I bring this up? Oh, in a way, like when I think of, I don't, you know, my sympathy is that Pinker, do you know who I'm talking about? I can't remember that guy's name.
The Righteous Mind, or is that someone else? I think that's Haidt.
Yeah, that's right. But this guy's out of Harvard and he writes these books that show, look, here's the level of starvation in the world. Here's how it's gone down. Here's the level of this and this and this. And he keeps showing all these good news. Like here's the infant mortality rate. Here's how it's gone down. Here's the level of peace we've had since World War II. You know, and the fraction of our population died in war has gone way down. And he's like showing all these things that make now look like the best time you could have ever been born into. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think he's right. And yet I also think what's right is we have more threats to our civilization now than ever before too. Global warming being a possibility, or any environmental destruction being a possibility, even the volcanic, right? But there's also, or asteroid or whatever, but there's also the type of work we're doing with viruses. There's also nuclear weapons. There's also AI. There's also like literally we are inventing new ways to wipe ourselves out. Right. So it's almost like there's this like, I don't want to call it progress, but there's this incredible thing that Steven Pinker's pointing out that's true. And there's also this incredible truth that you have more reasons to worry and that no one's on top of any of this stuff, you know? And it reminds, I keep thinking back of like, what were we like 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago, right? And it's like, well, I mean, they were just like, no one was ready for the Mongolian invasion. You know, no one, like they had their own catastrophic events that destroyed their civilization and their community. And it's almost like, can you even get people to work on a problem that's 10 years away, or does the problem have to be 1 year away?
It's a hard question to answer.
Or do you have to like experience an invasion where all your family got, you know, carried off into captivity or killed, and now you'll go prepare for the next invasion?
Yeah. And to rephrase, like at a more abstract level, I think what you're asking is to what extent are we individually and collectively, can we be agents of history? Like in terms of like act, plan, make centrally or decentralized, you know, how do we plan to make the world over in the way that we would like to, you know, which my exhibit A for how we can do that is the fact that you and I are both sitting in houses on opposite sides of the city, doing video telecommunication in houses that didn't exist 140 years ago. like part of the human nature is being able to work together to remake nature. But then there's this other thing. And the question is, how much of it is like our nature as originally made versus is it kind of fallout from original sin? Are we just patients and unforeseen things just happen to us, and then the best we can do is just cope?
Or what if they are foreseen, but it's just too far away? It's like if you take a snowboarder and you say, hey man, wear a helmet because you're going to, 20 years from now, you're going to have headaches if you don't wear this helmet. It's just like, that's 20 years from now.
Right. Right. And my position is just, if I'm world emperor and I just get to remake things.
Which you're not. Is that even a useful thought experiment, what you just proposed?
Is it too utopian?
Well, yeah. I just don't even understand what we're doing with those things,
So I'm using that as a device to say, if what seems pretty obvious to me is something we need to deal with in the next 5 to 50 years, if I'm obvious and the world emperor comes in to bridge the gap between what's obvious to me is not obvious to the vast majority of people. So we need some way that maybe I'm just so charismatic in this podcast right now that just a global raising of consciousness happens because of what comes out of this podcast, right? Imagine that happens. We would see that we do not need to keep growing Kansas City as it's currently being developed. That the reason that we keep building more suburbs, the urban sprawl, is a weird relic of our political economy. And what we should be doing for whatever weirdness is coming is en masse, professionals should be going back to the land and collectively kind of running farms, still doing their day jobs, because we don't need cities anymore. Like with this telecommunication stuff, I think we haven't even grasped how unnecessary congregating in offices to do a lot of the work is. And that's not to say there aren't going to be tragic losses from that. But at this point, the real reason we're expanding cities has to do with the real estate market being a kind of racket than that it actually serves human good. And if a lot of these people that could be telecommuting were living on farms that are having trouble making ends meet, and they could still be getting Amazon or something like it, their goods delivered to them, their kids could be growing up surrounded by more nature. Ideally, these communities would be able to foster better growth. Because I think there is something, I think leftists go wrong with wanting to get rid of the family. But I also think it's true having families cooped up in little houses and they're dependent pretty much just on themselves and on impersonal market forces is not ideal. I'm getting a little ranty. My point is only to say, how is that? Maybe that's utopian, but that to me seems less utopian than what we're actually doing in every way, except it isn't real and we haven't built it. But what we built has been centuries in the making. So why not that?
I feel like when you were talking about this, I think there's a lot of good things about cities, and I'm meeting a lot of people in Kansas City right now who are telecommuting, and they were living in LA or San Fran, and now they relocate here because they realized they didn't have to live in LA and San Fran, where it was they felt like they weren't able to live their best life, right? But instead of moving to small town Kansas, they still moved to a city.
Uh-huh.
Because they want something that the city's providing. I'm not even sure if that's just energy, but I guess but I don't disagree with you. And I guess my sense is you and I could have it out about the value of a city versus the value of rural living, right? I kind of like the neighborhood I'm in. I think my kids do too, but
well, and if I weren't a city person, I would be in Western Kansas or something. I'm a hypocrite in a way, but go ahead.
Okay. But we could have it out over what the city is, but really I think it's good that we let people choose, but I feel like if there was a concrete thing you could do to a regulation or a new organization or a political thing that was hey, here's one rule, that we could change that would point in the direction you want. I feel like that's not utopian. When you're trying to reinvent the way we work, the way we live, the way we organize in community, now you've taken on a project so complex that it's very speculative.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And
there's no way to get from here to there. There's no like, I feel like politics is almost like the idea of like how to get from here to there. Like if you just have the there and the here, I don't know that we've done much.
Yeah. And I would say there's a whole question of, if you call it evolution versus revolution, or with what I was saying back there, I wasn't saying cities should be gone, but that we are continuing to develop cities in specific ways. And you're right. If we intervened in certain ways, it's not about emptying Kansas City, but it's saying we should probably prioritizing doing, in my estimation, these projects that other people can opt into and show, okay, you can live in a city, you can live in the country, or you can live in these hybrid, kind of communal farms where you can have a number of the benefits of the city, and a number of the benefits of rural areas. And this would be more in line with especially what's called for in Laudato Si and the rest of the encyclicals.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of tragedy of the commons happening in the cities that you could really work on. Like I think more urban farming makes the city better, right? And I think urban sprawl I think the suburban sprawl is not a positive, and we could debate like little micro things like in the last 20 years, the amount of people moving back into the actual hub of the city and not sprawling has been tremendous. I don't know how important that is, but like, I think it's important, but I just mean, I don't think a disagreement on like how the city grows is that important. But I think like this idea of like, hey, like what if we created an extra tax on, I hate to say this, but like food, and put all that money into community agriculture. Now we have like a very like realistic idea that we can debate the pros and cons of that might move in the direction you want.
Definitely. Yeah. And I would briefly add, I mean, this is a big Michael Pollen point. People do not understand that when you go, whatever you go, let's say you go to the grocery store, you buy a frozen pizza, it says $3. People think they paid $3. What they don't understand is there's a huge amount of taxes that have gone to subsidize all sorts of things along that way. So actually, if you were to like tally it, well, I don't know, but it would be significantly more than $3.
Right.
So
one of the things we're like talking about on our podcast on an ongoing way is like this idea that like different interest groups like Big Ag can create policies that none of us have the incentive to really stand up against. And like how do we crack that open? And sometimes they do it even just by like, all the guys working at the USDA might retire and go work in Big Ag. They do it through a lot of methods besides just straight up lobbying, And
then we're back at the population en masse is patient. And then you have highly centralized corporations that are very active agents in the political process.
And I think of that, and not in the sense of passive and active. I think in that in the sense of like, it matters their whole livelihood, and it matters to all of us individually a little bit. So on net, the little bits are way more important than this one special interest group's massive benefit. But there's no incentive for us all that matters a little bit to organize, like there is for that person who their whole livelihood's at stake to organize.
Yeah.
All right. I guess we can wrap this up, But I guess I love these conversations. Like, how do we repeal the subsidy? How do we fix this lobbying problem? How do we do that? And I've always found like these bigger, what I'm calling utopian ideas, not useful and frustrating when people want to reform the whole church or reform all society. But I think you guys are doing a great job on your podcast of kind of pulling back in the real constantly. What do you want to say to cap that off? Because I don't want to have the final word on that.
And I'd say, and what we're trying to do with our Catholic worker is like live these values as best we can and try and be a platform for other people to do that as well. Is what we're trying to do. Because at the core of it, I mean, where we quibble about the wider macro utopian what should be stuff, but in principle, we agree. We need to have our hearts transformed by Christ. We need to care for our neighbors and the planet to the extent we can. And our best guess at how to do that is with this JPII Catholic worker. And we'll see how it goes. We're still early on.
That's great.
All right. Well, thank you for coming on the Simpleton podcast.
Thanks for
Thanks for
having
having
us.
us.
All right. I'll talk to you again later. All right. Please like, subscribe, and comment. Looking for feedback. Peace.